Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Other Minds and Hands. This is episode number 34, and today Maggie and I are joined by special guests. So this week we're going to be shifting gears, as we said we would. We're going to take a little break from The Lord of the Rings, and today we are talking about Dune, which is, of course, actually another of my favorite books. So I'm really excited to talk about this. I was very pumped for the recent adaptation. We're going to be spending our time focusing on the first half of the new adaptation, which was released last year. Well, actually, 2 years ago now?
Yeah, new one.
Year and a half, and then also, of course, with some glances back at the classic 1984 Dune adaptation, directed by David Lynch. So, and we are joined, our special guests, longtime friends of Signum, Dominic Nardi and Trevor Brierly, who are the co-editors of a new book called Discovering Dune. So we are fortunate to have some real Dune experts with us
hold
here.
Hold it up for a minute. Let us see it properly.
There we go.
Oh,
all
that's
right.
fab.
Mine's reversed for some reason. Get the mirror view.
Excellent. Okay, so I am excited to talk about Dune. There was so much hype about this last adaptation that I should admit I was really worried, because it was one of those things like building up huge expectations. What did you guys think of it? What was your primary reaction to seeing this latest film adaptation?
I feel like we should start from the very beginning. What were your first thoughts when the first trailer came out?
Oh, yeah. That's right. Let's start back before you first saw it. That's a better plan.
Yeah, like what was your first initial reaction to ooh, new one, or oh god, new one?
I'm always glad to see new adaptations. It's interesting to see people doing things differently. It's fun to compare them. I was hopeful. I liked a lot of things that I saw in the trailer, and I was hopeful that we were going to see something, really worthwhile.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So for really going back to the beginning, before the first trailer, before the announcement of the official Dune movie, I had become a fan of Denis Villeneuve, the director. He directed Blade Runner 2049. Before that, he directed Prisoners, Arrival, a bunch of other just excellent movies, especially science fiction movies. So shortly after Blade Runner 2049 came out, I read in the news that he wistfully said something like, I would love to direct Dune one day. That's his dream project. And lo and behold, the powers that be got the rights in place, and he directed Dune. So I was pretty hopeful, even from that first from the first rumblings we had, that he might be attached to the project. And one of the reasons I think I thought he was a good fit for Dune is because, as I suspect most people listening to this know, Dune is a pretty serious book, and it's a pretty intense book. And Denis Villeneuve knows how to direct serious, intense scenes. It's not. And I knew that this wasn't going to be a comedy or slapstick or something that treated the characters with disrespect. So.
And they really played that up in the early days of the marketing too, his own passion for it. So that interested me in terms of the fan management side of things. They were talking about how he kind of wanted to cut his teeth on Blade Runner and Arrival so he would be prepared to do Dune justice. I thought that was a nice angle. He wanted to make sure that this was right. So therefore, of course, as fans, you're going to be like, okay, maybe you're in good hands.
Yeah. And Dom, I would say it also seems like it kind of put you in the thing that jumps out at me about your reaction there is thinking, you were thinking from the beginning, not about, in a sense, primarily Dune showing up on screen, but about the work that was going to be done by this particular director, right? That is, it seems like you were already kind of thinking about this film first and foremost as a creative enterprise by this filmmaker, which seems to me a really happy place to begin a relationship with. I mean, it's one of the things that we often talk about is that an adaptation, of course, is first and foremost its own work of art, right? It's importantly connected with the source text, but its first responsibility has to be being an excellent film on its own.
Being a good story.
Yeah, it has to be. It has to be doing whatever it is, whether it's a film or some other genre, whatever. But like it has to be what it is, and it has to do a good job of being what it is. So the fact that you were really interested in seeing just a film made by this filmmaker does seem to put the thing on profitable grounds from the very beginning. Cool.
There were a couple good angles with that, weren't there? Like, we had this director who has a really good pedigree and incredible visual style. So I hope we talk about the visuals of Dune.
Man.
But also we had Timothée Chalamet, who has kind of a teeny bopper following, but of an indie variety. And then we have Zendaya, who came from the Disney backgrounds. Like, you have these very strange pedigrees of actors being cast in these roles that you wouldn't necessarily assume. But I think that brought a load of different audiences to this film that maybe another person wouldn't necessarily engage with because it was like too sci-fi or whatever. So maybe it opened up a few doors, but it was nice to see them broaden their own net in all those choices.
How about you, Trevor? What were some of your early reactions to the idea of the adaptation?
Like I said, I mean, I enjoy new adaptations. I enjoy comparing, and I enjoy kind of looking at how somebody's new vision and how they're going to do something differently. I was hopeful, like I said, with the trailer. I think that my impression was kind of from the beginning that maybe they're going to get the Fremen right. Because I think if you don't get the Fremen right, then you're done. You might as well just go home. You have to get the Fremen right, and I think he's getting the Fremen right, and that means a lot to me, because that to me, the heart of the movie, at least as far as I'm concerned, has to do with the Fremen and how their struggle and how that intersects with what's happening with the Atreides.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's really hard to put words on those things. Do you mind just talking a little bit more about what would make the Fremen right in your perspective? Because I'm always curious about how filmmakers would then capture some of that essence, and if he accomplished that.
I think for me, I knew we might be in good hands with the very beginning of it, where it starts with the Fremen and it talks about their struggle, how they've been oppressed for so long, they've been fighting for so long. And you see that there's a later scene where Stilgar comes in, to the conference room. He looks tired. He looks like somebody who's a leader of a people who are constantly on the run, constantly being persecuted. He's tired. Park's tired. And that to me really gave us a picture of who the Fremen are and what they've been facing that I don't think I've seen in any of the other movies really well done.
Yeah. If I could jump on to that, because I felt the same way about the Fremen. I think Dune is a really complicated story, and one of the reasons it's complicated because it comes across as a white savior narrative, even though it actually isn't. Paul is not the savior of the Fremen, and also the Fremen are not a bunch of helpless people with brown or darker skin. The Fremen have their own vibrant culture, but they also have a lot of agency in the book, and they have a lot of dignity, and that's something that I think came across really well. Javier Bardem's performance of Stilgar was great. He came into that room with Duke Atreides, and he was not bowing down to anybody. He was not in a secondary position. He was not learning from the off-worlders. He was teaching them the ways of his world. And that's, I think, what worked about the Fremen for me. I did not feel like they were passive characters just following Paul.
Right. Yeah. And that, just as you guys were mentioning, that it was, to me, when I just rewatched the film, which was actually only the second time I saw it in the theaters, and then I just watched it again. And that was one of the things that really struck me most, was the frame, the fact that they framed the whole story from the start as a Fremen story. And you think, just to make the point of contrast, the David Lynch film frames it with Princess Irulan. which is a totally defensible frame. Like, it was
It's accurate to the book.
It's exactly. It really. When I was watching, I watched them in that. I watched the David Lynch. I rewatched the David Lynch one first, and then I rewatched the new one. And and when I was watching that, I was like, oh yeah, that's really clever. Like, to start with the Princess Irulan frame, because it's, her voice is so persistent throughout the book, and yet, of course, she never appears as a character until the very last moment. But yeah, I was like, okay, I see what they're doing there with the Princess Irulan frame, and that's interesting. And they framed it like really as an imperial story. They actually even leaned more heavily into the Princess Irulan's role, showing her on screen and everything, interacting with the Emperor and whatnot. So again, totally defensible from the standpoint of the book. But then when I rewatched the new one and we had that Fremen frame at the start of the film, I was like, that's so much better. It's so much better. I appreciate what they were trying to capture from the first one. But it did really change things very, very importantly, I think. What do you guys think about... Because, I mean, Tom, as you said, the Princess Irulan frame is more accurate to the book. Framing the whole narrative, as they did, as a kind of Fremen narrative. And I would add, did it seem to you... I'm trying to figure out how to say this. His dreams. He has, dreams of Chani in his... in the book, of course. The film, the new film, plays that up enormously, right? I mean, she appears on screen like 80 times before he meets her, right? I mean, he's constantly, everything that happens, he's having like flash forwards to her, and she's the narrator of that initial framing sequence, right? And so it seemed to me that his Fremen visions were continuing, even though we weren't interacting with Fremen yet. Like, it continued to keep the Fremen as this sort of framing mechanism through the entire, like, maintain the fact that even Paul's story was a Fremen story, in a sense, from the beginning, right? Before he even arrived on Dune and was still on Caladan. So that was, I thought, very, very interestingly done. But of course it is a significant shift. I mean, in the book, the Fremen are mysterious at the beginning, right? We're very firmly in the book, from the frame, from the standpoint of the Atreides, with some glimpses into the viewpoint of the Harkonnens, right? But it's very much from the colonizers' viewpoint. And they have differing views of the Fremen, and we talk about the Fremen a lot, but we don't actually interact with the Fremen, apart from that one appearance by Stilgar, until, the night of the attack, basically, when we start getting them in a couple different places. But anyway, what I'm saying is, I liked it too, the Fremen frame. I liked it very much, but it actually doesn't seem... It seems like they're doing something different than what the book did in that way. Or do you think that they're coming a different way around to capturing a similar thing? What do you guys think about that?
I think the latter, actually. So if we can go back to the David Lynch film, one of the challenges I think that film had is, in some ways, and just to be clear, I am somebody who usually likes adaptations to stick to the book. But I think the David Lynch film really struggled in sticking too close to the book sometimes. Dune, if you read the book, has a lot of interior monologue and characters thinking about what other characters are thinking about. And
Yes.
And David Lynch literally said, okay, let's do a voiceover and voice the thoughts. And that's kind of clunky. And the Irulan is another example. There are epitaphs in the book, most of them written by Irulan, introducing each chapter. And David Lynch literally did that with Irulan at the beginning. And I don't think that works as well for a movie. Whereas I think in the Denis Villeneuve version, the dream sequences are a combination of vision and sound and areas where movies actually have a comparative advantage over books. Like, you can't have a sound, you can't have a short music sequence in a book. So I think it just works for that reason. But also, even though there's a shifting perspective at the beginning, it ties thematically into Paul's arc. And if you notice, when Chani is speaking and she's talking about the struggle for freedom, then she ends by saying, who will be our next oppressor? And then the camera cuts to Paul. And
Yes.
I don't think that is a coincidence.
No, I noticed that.
It is
Yeah.
exactly the theme of Paul potentially becoming a dictator and becoming a charismatic leader who brings oppression to the Fremen.
In a very different way than she was expecting when she said
exactly.
that. Yeah.
Exactly. So it's getting that theme, but in a way that a movie can, because in a book you cannot cut to a different image in a book unless it's a picture book. But
Right.
Dune is not a picture book.
Right. And even picture books don't have scores, unfortunately. So yes, you're right. You're right. Yeah. Well, Trevor, you spoke of the need to get the Fremen right, which again I completely agree with. Do you think that sort of I was going to say elevation, but that's not quite right. Sort of placing of the Fremen at sort of front and center from the start is something that contributed to help us understand them better? And if so, how? What do you think are some of the impacts that has on our understanding of the Fremen in the film?
I think it definitely gives us a sense that what we're going to see might start out with being about the Atreides and being about sort of the Imperium, which I think in some sense we can kind of identify with. It's, obviously far in the future and very different, but I think we probably can identify a little bit more with the world of the Imperium than the world of the Fremen. So I think it immediately puts us into that Fremen world and immediately gives us the sense that we're in something different. We're in a secondary world already from the very beginning. So I think it really sets that up very strongly.
That's a really interesting point, because it is true. When we start off on Caladan, right, the differences between that secondary world and our experience are kind of gentle, right? I mean, that is, it's one of those things where, as you're reading Dune, you come across things which are unexpected, but they're small things. I mean, daily life within the Imperium is not wholly unlike ours. I mean, they have some different technologies and some different practices, but it's not clear where the boundaries are exactly, right? We'll get I'm trying to remember exactly how chapter one is just the visit of the Reverend Mother, right, and the Gom Jabbar, right? So I don't think it's until the Pain Box, I think the Pain Box is the first sci-fi technology that we get, I think, if I'm recalling correctly. I'm just
Probably
trying,
overtly.
Spencer in there.
Yeah, maybe, yeah, exactly, maybe one or two references. Anyway, the point is, it's fairly so. Anyway, all this is to say, I agree with you, Trevor. That kind of immersion into this is a completely different world, right? And even if there are, and we think of how in the film, because I wasn't processing it this way, I was thinking mostly of wow, from the Fremen perspective. But you're right, we were getting the spaceships and shielded paratroopers and all this kind of thing, in that opening sequence, right, in fighting the Fremen. It was much more firmly situating us in, this is the sci-fi world. Here are some of the things that happen in this sci-fi world. The spice farming and everything else. I mean, it was very much more alien than the opening sequence with Paul on Caladan in the book is alien to our own experience.
And that's the word I find most powerful, alien. That I almost think that might have been his entire purpose, because in the book we have kind of the time to sit with that and become part of that world. I don't feel like that was the purpose of Dune film. It was awe-inspiring in every way visually. Those establishing shots that were so wide with those massive ships and the tiny scout ships going down, and just the scale of everything and the way these shots were set up with the scale. I feel like every shot just looked like an incredible piece of graphic art from the 70s. It was like a beautiful concept. I don't know, did you guys just see that New York Times article about Tron AI, concept art created by an AI about Tron? So they compiled all the different descriptions of Tron and created their own concept art, so not an actual artist did that. And there's a whole documentary about that, and it's the same guy that did the documentary about the Dune that didn't get made. So it's just a really interesting comparison of just like the art of that era and what it inspired, and it was beautifully put together. But it made me relook at these shots and be like, whoa. And I feel like that was quite purposeful in setting up this other world. We didn't have the time like we do with the book to kind of feel that slow immersion. We had to be given that immersion.
Yes.
And it was pretty.
Yeah. The visuals are really stunning. I was completely blown away again. It was one of the primary impacts of the second viewing was just it's quite astounding.
And the costuming too, the tallness, there were so many parts.
And I think that's one of the reasons why, even if the movie deviates from the book, and even if I wish the banquet scene had been in the movie, just the visuals, the costumes, the acting brings so much to the story, especially because Frank Herbert is not a very descriptive writer. Like, I've read Dune several times. I can't tell you what Jessica wears.
Right.
I can barely tell you what she looks like in the book. But in the movie, you just get and even the David Lynch film has some interesting visual choices.
They do. It does. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I didn't love all of them, but yes, many of them. It was. Like I said, I really enjoyed the David Lynch film way more than I ever remembered doing when I watched it this past time. It was very interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I don't even know what to say about the visuals apart from just like the scale, Maggie, that you mentioned was one of the things. And this is, of course, that's a major theme, motif at least, in the books, right? I mean, like the book is frequently mentioning, like when they're traveling from Caladan to Arrakis, and we get this brief glimpse of how enormous a Guild Highliner is and how everything that they have from their planet is fitting in this one small corner, and there could be 12 other sets of passage, like it's so just this idea of the enormousness, which kind of conveys this idea that the Guild is bigger than planets, right? Like it's but yeah, and then the same thing with the emphasis on the scope of the Harkonnen attack, right? Which is the scale of which, Thufir Hawat just like never even imagined could possibly have been paid for.
It's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying to watch.
Yes. Yeah. My favorite moments are the for just that visual sense of scale, the landing of the ship on Caladan, like when that like egg descends from the sky, right? And then the ramp coming down. I mean, oh man, it's just so good. I
feel like that bears rewatching, right? Like when you think about how big things are, you can also think about how small things are. Like we have those massive ships, the massive city, but then we have that like tiny insect that tries to kill him. We have these really minuscule things that are quite highlighted as well. There doesn't seem to be much in the middle. Sorry?
The little tiny sleep pills. They look like Ambien or something.
Yes. Yeah,
and you also have an ecosystem with giant sandworms, and then at the opposite end, you have the Maladif, the little desert mouse.
The desert mouse.
Yeah.
There's nothing in the middle.
I was so glad that they preserved. It was one of the things that I felt the loss of most keenly in the Lynch film was the mouse. That he like took his name after the moon instead of the mouse in the David Lynch film. I loved the preservation of the mouse. But yeah, of course, Maggie, the magnitude of the sandworms, like that's in a sense, that's the biggest thing in the film, right? In the whole book, really too. And that first image, like the first time we see one, where you have this enormous spice crawler, right? Which is like representing this sort of technological world of that we've been so awed by at various points, and then just to see the sandworm come up and swallow it whole.
Like it was a tic tac. I mean, it was
Yes.
tiny. Yeah.
Yes. That is, in a sense, I feel like that that moment in the book is one of the thing that really kind of it's one of the I think what it's one of the defining moments in the book. You know, when the sandworm comes up and eats the spice crawler. As far as like really kind of, if you want a pointer to like the themes of the book, right, and what's important in the book, that moment I think is a really huge one, and I thought that was done so well. What did you guys? So one change that I thought was really interesting that they inserted in this film, because that is such a big moment, and they were doing that moment, and they were doing that moment very well, I thought. But they took what I felt was a real risk by mixing another, like they added another thing to that scene, which was Paul's first exposure to the spice and his first spice visions, which was a lot, I thought, to add to that. That was one of the like riskiest things I felt going on, especially in that scene. But even in the films, I was like, wow, that was really distracting in the middle of, you know, what I've always felt to be that really, really important moment. What did you guys think of that, and the way that it was kind of overlaid at that moment?
I think it worked out really well, actually. You're starting with this moment where there's this crisis going on, and there's machinery, and they're trying to get everybody out, and then it kind of cuts very quickly to, all of a sudden we're focused on Paul and that his first experience and what's going on with him. I think that really juxtaposes those two very different views of Arrakis. You have machines that are there that take the spice, and then you have the other part of the spice, which is these visions and hallucinations and so forth. I thought it worked out very well.
So my experience with that scene was a little bit different, and only in that, there were fan screenings of like 5-10 minutes of film several months before the film came out, and I attended one of those, and so we got to see that scene, and I think the scene of Jessica and Paul at a dining table in Caliban. So I saw that scene with the Spice Harvester kind of on its own, in isolation, out of context from the rest of the film. And I suspect that the marketing folks chose that scene because it is such an, as you said, it's crucial in the book. It's such a powerful scene, and the film nails it. So, and I think, I thought I thought it worked, and I thought those changes worked. And going back to what I was saying before, it ties into, it is consistent with Paul's arc. It is a change from the book, but it's not feel that they were doing something drastically different from his character. Now, if they had, I don't know, say just purely hypothetically, if Paul had made it rain on Arrakis, because I don't think any director would ever do that in a Dune adaptation, that would maybe not be a good idea.
The only defense I would offer, and I would not offer a strong defense of making it rain on Arrakis, is that it was, so of course, the reference for those not familiar, it's the very closing scene of the David Lynch film, is that he basically makes it rain on Arrakis, as the sort of outward symbol of like his, and so that's the first part of my defense, is that it's like the sort of the final symbolic gesture towards the end of Dune is weird, like it's weird. Like there are no two ways about that. The last moments in Dune in the book are strange. It's a strange and often unsettling and ending, and it doesn't feel resolved at almost at all, really. You get hints. It's handled interestingly because, of course, there's a deliberate sort of irony in the book, right? On the one hand, Paul's been remembering the future like all the way through, especially in the second half of the book. He knows, like, we're told what's going to happen. We've been told what's going to happen next all the way through. The only question is whether or not. So the closure is not like, let's show you what happened next, but rather, okay, and now he knows it's actually going to happen. You know, this thing that he was trying to, you know, so it's part of the weirdness of the ending, I think, is the way that Herbert is deliberately playing with the like temporal prophecy stuff that's going on with Paul. But it's still not, you know, I can see why a filmmaker would be like, I want to put a clearer bow on things.
Mark. Yeah,
I want that. And so in a sense, it felt to me, I mean, yes, like the mere idea of Paul somehow making it rain on Arrakis for no reason like with no physics or meteorology behind that whatsoever was weird. But as a purely symbolic, like, element,
punctuation mark,
of like, here is so, and thus does Paul Muad'Dib now establish a new era, and like it's like the entire future climatological change of Arrakis and ushering in of the Fremen era and everything else, all like put into one little symbol that took 3 seconds on film. So like in that way I was like, okay, right, I can kind of, I mean, it was weird and odd.
Like as a device, it works.
As a device, it works. Yeah.
Right. But you can hear the groans around the world as it happened. Yeah. Right. It's a risky device.
It was.
Yeah.
But though, oh well. Okay, hang on. I was gonna. This is tempting me to think about how you think the second film is going to end. But let's wait for speculation, because that's let's finish talking about the first one first. Yeah. Maggie, go ahead.
I don't know. I'm still got back on visuals, and I'm just curious what you guys thought about design, because you probably know more about like the work that went into it. But my husband and I were talking about it, and I'm like, I think the thing that I love about this most recent adaptation is how it's still kind of grounded in our own reality. Mm-hmm. Like there's so many elements of this Dune that are just different enough to be alien, like the helicopters that are dragonflies, right? Like. Right. That is something I recognize. I understand how a helicopter works, but then all of a sudden the wings open differently and it flies differently. So I think
maybe
in terms of
storytelling, instead of ornithopters is kind of, but anyway, yeah.
Also made me think of Oliphaunts, because it's the same kind of concept. Like it's just a little bit different that you're like, I recognize that, but so yeah, as a device, I just liked that. I'm just curious if there's other things that stuck out to you visually that worked well.
I think overall, the color scheme really kind of stuck out to me as you keeping these kind of gritty shades. Nothing's particularly terribly clear, but it's not particularly out of focus either. So I really enjoyed the color scheme. I think they communicated a lot through the color scheme. You have all the gorgeous, powerful desert colors. But then in the world of the Imperium and the world of the Harkonnen, you have these different kind of almost disgusting colors going on in the Harkonnen world, and the Atreides world is still kind of dark and a little grungy. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Harkonnen world almost looked like moldering, didn't it? It was like, hey, yeah.
Which really felt to me like I thought they captured the spirit of the Harkonnen world and the Harkonnen house so well in this film. That was, I have to say, one of my biggest disappointments in the David Lynch film. Like, of all of the things one can complain about, the Harkonnens were one of my least favorite. I thought the Baron was terrible. Like, he was just this, like, maniacally cackling madman all the way through. Whereas, like, the Baron is a genius. He is a strategic genius. Ruthless, horrible, disgusting, but brilliant. I thought that the performances and the overall depiction, Trevor, as you were saying, the visuals, it was so good in this film.
We talk a few minutes about the music.
Yeah. I was just going to come back to that.
I think that's probably my favorite part of the movie, because they just got everything right. I mean, the scenes where terrible things are happening, the music just amplifies the terror. Like the whole scene with the attack on the Atreides is just music is just crushing.
And ethereal.
Yeah.
It's so powerful, and sometimes it's almost silent. It's so powerful. There's these long
Yeah.
stretches of just kind of a metallic almost sound that turns into a musical note that I found that building suspense. So that, you know, that there's so many different ways to build suspense in film, and they were so good at doing that you can have that long establishing shot with a single tone, and that is more terrifying than anything you could show me in that moment.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, the music was beautiful. I think it was quite divisive though, wasn't it? When there was a lot of kickback about it.
I think the device, I haven't heard of a lot of criticism of the music. I've heard some folks saying that it maybe was forgettable or doesn't have the themes that Toto's soundtrack for the 1984 film had, because it doesn't have themes. Like there's nothing you can hum for like Paul's theme or the Baron's theme. And but
or
no, I thought
Tolkien,
the music worked
since
really
we
well.
talk about that so much.
Right. Like Lord of
Right.
the Rings, you can hum the ring race, score. There's nothing in, but I think that was deliberate. Hans Zimmer had talked about how he wanted the soundtrack to Dune to sound alien and foreign. So I think that some of that otherness, that almost it not being approachable in a hummable way, made sense for the work.
There were even the moments, and if I'm remembering correctly, I wasn't paying super close attention to the score this time through, but there were moments, and I think it was during the attack, when the music was mostly just like this sort of like metallic, discordant beats.
Horn blares.
Yeah,
Beats.
exactly.
Yeah.
Beats and blares, which I remember hearing, and I was like, that is chilling and feels really apropos. But it is not, I mean, it certainly does not, Dom, exactly as you say, it's not like I'm going to be, going to get this stuck in my head, and be singing this all day or something like that. It really was, there's something, I think, kind of both daring and also kind of humble about the score in that way, like to establish alienness, right? To make this clearly, weird in the way that it was, and yet to really effectively create that feel, but at the expense of good music, that I thought was really interesting.
I still listened to it for weeks after, though. You're right. It didn't have those catchy tunes that I sing along to and wish I could play on a piano or anything like that. But it was somehow so haunting is the wrong word because it has such a negative connotation, but it really engaging. I kind of felt like I had to keep engaging with it because I understood the story more if I listened to it, and it told its own story. And then when you add that to the visual story and then the words and then the performance, it really played a very strong role in this adaptation.
Yeah. In general, I was a big fan. I thought it, especially the way that it interacted with the visuals, that sense of grandeur and alien, but alien grandeur, not like necessarily swelling orchestral. Yeah, exactly. Not like bringing out the big band or something, but I mean that sense of what you're seeing is grand and imposing, but very strange and very alien. For instance, the recapitulation of the ship descent, that when the Reverend Mother comes privately to Jessica, right? And so we get that like descent in the woods in the dark with the floodlights, the darkness and the lights and the black-robed figures coming out, right? That whole like that sense of like mystery right on the edge of horror that we see in so many places, even though that like the scale of that was so much smaller than the scale of the other. It's still like the parallel was eerie, but like the darkness and the black and white palette and the but anyway, the way that the music really sort of added to that sense of hauntingness. I mean, it was almost alien I felt in a frightening way at many points, and I thought that was very effective.
Some of the folks in the Discord chat are so one of the things in Discord chat is that folks are actually mentioning that Zimmer made some of his own instruments for the music, joking that he spent a lot of time in the hardware store. But that is very much a Zimmer thing, just as we were talking about how this is very much a Denis Villeneuve movie. Hans Zimmer, one of the things he's been doing recently in his films like Blade Runner 2049 is soundtracks that almost blend in with the sound effects. You know, they're just parts of the soundtrack that almost sound like machines moving. So just, again, it's really interesting decisions across the board.
And I was going to point to the same thing, that conversation that's going on, and that point that Meow Indeed made. Hans Zimmer actually said, why are sci-fi movies all classical music, like Star Wars with brass and strings? I hadn't really thought about that, but like you said, Corey, using this kind of sound and these made up instruments, that is so not what we expect. And I don't understand that sound because I don't know that instrument. So you can't show it to me and I can know what to expect. That automatically sets us on like shaky ground of like, what? You know, so how powerful for a sound to be able to unsettle us.
Yeah. Unsettling is and that combination of the visuals and the sound, that and the like emotional combination of awe and unsettled, right, was to me a very characteristic feature of the experience of this film. That it was beautiful and striking and awe-inspiring. The visuals were, but it was strange, mysterious, and unsettling at the same time. And thinking about those things in connection with the book, I felt that those elements, while not alien to the book, were more pronounced in the film than they were in the book. The book feels, I don't know, to me it feels more, it's like I was saying before, the way in which when we're first introduced, it's like much like our world, but we see the differences kind of gradually as we go through, and some of them are fairly profound as we find how far in the future they are, and you know the situation with the Landsrod is never really explained, and you know, so we, at least not in book one, right, so we don't have any really clear sense exactly of what's going on, but the politics aren't alien. Like, the politics seem understandable. Like, you know, we don't know all the vocabulary, but we have some sense of that. Even things like, you know, your chom prophets and stuff, like, you know, yeah, I still don't understand that by the end of the first book exactly, but I understand enough to be able to it doesn't seem alien. It doesn't seem strange. It's just a different setting. I felt that they really leaned into both, you know, all of those things, which are all there in the book: the grandeur, the strangeness, the unsettlingness of it. There are moments in the book where he really leans hard into that. I felt the Gum Jabbar scene is one that really jumps out in my mind as a place where that's really being emphasized in the book. But I felt that the film went interestingly and productively beyond the book in the effects that it creates. I never had the sense of of Arrakeen. That Arrakeen in the book just kind of felt like a city. Like, it was strange because it was on Arrakis, and there were still characteristically Arrakis elements of the culture. It's the water and everything, but yeah, it was I did think it went beyond the book, which is what I find a really interesting choice, and the fact that it seems to me a very, very successful choice. Is it good when a film adaptation does, like, brings out an element of the book, even if it's bringing it out further than the book? I don't know. I think it felt good. It felt successful in that way.
Yeah, and I think if it's consistent with the themes and the character arcs of the book, I think Denis Villeneuve achieved that with this book. I can think of examples. where his stuff is added to an adaptation, and it just, it's the story that used to be about, political intrigue is now more of a romantic comedy. Okay, that's probably not a good change.
Right.
We had that question earlier that, I mean, we've talked about it a lot. What's more important, tone or structure in an adaptation? And I mean, I don't mean to be blunt, but I'm pretty sure it's always going to be tone, right? Like structure is going to have to shift because we're shifting around all this stuff, and everything you guys are saying is very positive. I shouldn't be shocked, but usually when you talk to somebody that knows the text so well, they're going to pull out some things that are really bothersome. So maybe we'll get some of that still. There's still half hour, but it's so nice to hear like the support of the changes. Like this made sense because it still landed. This made sense because it still landed. And yeah, I think you're right. As long as that comes through, it works.
Partially because I've listened to your podcast and we've talked about adaptation. I was watching the film, constantly thinking about some of the changes, and there were times when I said, "Man, I wish they could have had this scene from the book. I wish they could have done the banquet scene. I wish we could have spent more time with the Harkonnens. I wish we could have had Fade." But I also could not think through a way to make that happen without the film dragging on, or without introducing a bunch of names and terms and concepts that would alienate most audience members. Like if you notice, the word mentat is never uttered in the film. And I, as a Dune fan, would love to hear more discussion about mentats in the film. But I also realize you didn't need it.
Yeah. One really small thing, which, well, it puzzled me not because of their leaving it out in the film, but because I felt like they set it up and then they didn't pay it off. They had the bull's head. We got the whole scene of the packing up of the bull's head and the packing up of the picture of the
and the zoom in on the bullfight. Figurines.
Yeah, we got all that stuff. And so I was ready. Dom, I didn't know if we were going to get the banquet scene or not, but I was all ready for like the hanging up of the bull's head in Arrakeen, and maybe even the debate between Jessica and Leto about like whether or not it had to be there, right? But like it got packed up in a box and we never saw it again. I don't remember seeing it again. It certainly didn't get emphasized so I was a little like, I felt like it was setting. I was really impressed when I saw it in the film. I'm like, I can't believe they did the bull's head, and are giving this time to the all the bullfighting stuff, and then we didn't get it. We didn't get it back again. I mean, I guess in a sense, like there's in the book, there's an obvious parallel, right, between the bull and Baron Harkonnen. At least I think that's sort of a fairly clear little parallel, that we get the old Duke bullfighting, putting himself at risk in the ring and dying because the bull kills him, and the parallel between Duke Leto coming to Arrakis, putting himself deliberately in danger, knowing that he's goading the bull, that he's being set up and going to be trapped, and the Harkonnens are going to try to spring the trap on him, but like a matador, he's going to face the bull, and of course the bulk of the Baron making it with the sort of physical parallel to the bull. So I was, there's all that stuff kind of going on in the book. And I thought they were, so in a sense, I guess, like you could say that, the arrival of Baron Harkonnen is like the payoff of the bull stuff. But I don't know. That was one like little small disappointment that I had. Not just from like they changed the thing from the book, but because they set it up. I found it in the end a little puzzling. I was wondering if they cut something. I don't know. Like, is this an editing issue? It was almost
like either they cut something or they were trying for an Easter egg, but they leaned too hard. Like you hinted too heavy on that Easter egg for now it became important.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. It's a small point, but I thought that was a little strange.
Can I ask what you guys thought about where it ended, where the first film ended? Because I thought it went too long. I would have been quite happy with Jessica and Paul on top of the dune looking off into the horizon. But I also understand that we had to spend more time with the Fremen and understand their culture a bit more. So I assume that's why they put it on, to kind of introduce that theme. But it didn't fit for me pace-wise. And And I'm just curious, especially because where you think it should end and what is important for us going into the second half. What do we need to be aware of? What cliff are we hanging on?
I was actually pretty happy with the way it ended because I
Yeah.
think, if you look at the book, there's a very definite transition between the Atreides Imperium world, and then you're moving into the Fremen world, which is very, very different. And I think the way that they've done this is they've given you the Imperium part of the puzzle. Now they're giving you a little tiny bit of the Fremen part and setting you up for the rest of the movie, which is going to be very Fremen, I think very Fremen heavy. I was very happy with the way it ended. I'm psyched for the second one, which is, I think, a good thing for it to have done is to set me up to really look forward to the second one.
Yeah, I was also. I wouldn't say I was. I wouldn't say. I understand the criticism that it may have gone on too long, but again, this is one of those adaptation choices where I tried to think of a better place to end it, knowing that they have to include.
Right.
They have to include the fight with Jameis. Like that is going to be somewhere. If it's going to be in part 1 or part 2, and but. And I could see an argument for making this a TV show because there's a lot of content to cover. But given that it's not a TV show, given that it has to go somewhere, it makes sense, I think, where it is. Especially because at this point in the book, shortly after the fight with Jameis, there is a time jump. And I suspect Dune Part 2 is going to, I don't know if they're going to state it outright, but I suspect there's going to be at least a bit of a time jump between the two movies. So you couldn't have put the Jameis fight
2-year
in part
time
2.
jump is probably going to be between.
Yeah.
That's what I'm thinking. And so you can't have to fight Jameis in part 2. So I don't know how else you fit that in.
Yeah, and it was also really important that we start to see Paul's awakening and allegiance leaving what he's known. And I love how they played up the relationship of Paul and his father and like making that choice and coming into his own. And that plays onto all the, the monomyth stuff that we've talked about before and just taking up that mantle, answering that call, but not in a way we thought he would.
I think Paul undergoes a transformation even within the first movie. He kind of starts out in some ways very passive. I mean, he's 15 years old, so he's, very undeveloped, but he starts out very kind of passive. I mean, compared to, like, for example, the Sci-Fi Channel version where Paul starts out just very, very angry and very aggressive. In this one, he's much more passive, but then you see him becoming more kind of stronger. He's fighting against the storm, and then he's in this scene where he has to kill his first person, and he does it, and he's not happy about it, but he does it because he has to. And then I think that sets us up really nicely for, I think we're going to see a real transformation of Paul in the second movie where he's going to be a lot more of a stronger character who's making things happen rather than having things happen to him.
And the Jameis fight is also really important. And this might not be fully clear to folks who've only seen the movies and not read the books, but the Jameis fight is crucial too because it's one of the first times that Paul is really using prescience to see the future, and he's seeing Jihad. He's also thinking, well, what happens if Jameis kills me? Like, I can see that future. I can see another future. And this is something I actually played around with a bit in the article I wrote for our book about how this is a turning point. And I don't know if Paul fully realized it at the time, but the fight with Jameis was a turning point. If Paul had been killed during the fight with Jameis, the future would have been different. The Jihad probably wouldn't have happened and a bunch of consequences. Later on, Paul's choices, his decision space starts to really narrow.
Yeah, it really is an enormous turning point, the fight with Jameis. That was my prediction as to where it was going to end, was right after the fight with Jameis. I do agree with Blood Little Tempered on the Twitch chat is saying that he was surprised he didn't choose his name.
Yeah.
I was surprised by that too. I kind of expected Paul Muad'Dib to be, like among the last words said in part 1, and I was surprised that didn't happen. What do you guys think about that? Why? I mean, because it's huge, right? I mean, on the one hand, I guess you could say it's a way, like, he's Lisan al-Gaib in the first film and Muad'Dib in the second film, in one sense, you could say. We did get Mahdi briefly, right, among the Fremen who were, guarding the outside of the ecological center there at the end. But anyway, yeah, to sort
the
of
whole
save
fight with Jamis
Muad'Dib
was
at
a
the
little
end.
bit strange because, first of all, it takes place outside, which that kind of grated on me a little bit. It's like the Fremen don't fight outside. They don't have these kind of fights outside because you lose water and all that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But there is no follow-up with the funeral and his mourning for what he's done, the balisette and the naming. All of that is missing, and I'm wondering how it's going to look a little weird in the second movie if they try and have that scene. But maybe, one thought that occurred to me is maybe they're saving everything that happens in the siege. They're kind of saving it for budget reasons and maybe kind of ooh-ah reasons for the siege to become part. We only see that in the second movie. That's one of the things it's on our things we're looking forward to list.
I just had an idea. What if they're going to do the naming, the arrival at the siege, the Reverend Mother ceremony, all that stuff, right? What if they're going to be doing that at various points in flashbacks so that they lean into the messing up of the temporal framework in the second film? Because we're getting flashing back to the past, flashing forward to the future. Yeah. They could lean into the whole temporal scale shift by introducing more of that in flashback. Then you'd have just more opportunity to mess with the temporal frame. Is this a memory of the past? Is this a memory of the future from Paul? Right. So, sorry,
that would certainly work well.
An idea I just had, but yeah,
we'll take
that. Would be cool. That would be cool.
You guys had talked a fair bit to us before just about comparison to Lord of the Rings. So I just kind of wanted to make sure that we at least brought that up if that's a burning topic you want to discuss. We talk about it a lot here. Just the comparison, if that's a topic you want us to expand on, or if we're happy just kind of doing this. I'm loving this too.
I don't know. Those two franchises, or whatever you want to call it, are kind of compartmentalized in my brain. So.
And it feels like a really big topic, and it feels like a really big thing to bring to the table with 15 minutes
they're
left.
wonderful books, but for very different reasons. One is a dystopia, the other one's a utopia, in various ways. So they're just very, very different. But
I think one thing I would mention about that comparison is that we don't have to go too far in comparing the books and the movies, but I did find it interesting that in the Lord of the Rings films, obviously there was a choice to quote unquote humanize or make some of the characters more relatable, and I think we saw something similar with Dune. The characters in Dune are pretty humorless, and I think in the movie they show more emotion. Duncan Idaho he's a bit of a bro, and that might just be a Jason Momoa thing, but it also it was clearly a choice to make him a bit more humorous. Jessica cries several times, or shows grief or concern, and that's just Jessica in the book doesn't do that. But I'd be interested to kind of get thoughts on that. And my feeling is that Dune comes across as a text that exists within the secondary world of Dune. It's almost a compiled historical text, so it's more more Robert Caro than like HBO drama, and it's history books are often not known for talking about the emotions, showing the emotions of their historical subjects. So I think just as an adaptation, I think the movie had to convey some of that, and I don't see that as contradicting the book all that much.
And there were some of the ways in which I'm thinking of Duncan Idaho in particular, right? One of the things that I felt very strongly in the book was Paul's attachment to Duncan Idaho. But the book does very little to attach me as a reader to Duncan Idaho. So I felt like I had a lot of secondhand attachment. I could tell that I was supposed to feel very strongly, because Paul was feeling very strongly, but but I mean, we meet Duncan Idaho several times, but we're not given many reasons to connect with him, really. I feel in the book, Gurney more than Duncan in that way within the book. But I really liked the way that Jason Momoa played Duncan Idaho, and I definitely felt more of an even the fact, again, in the book we are told that Duncan Idaho is one of the greatest fighters known, right? But I'm pretty much asked to accept that on faith. I see we're given very little reason. I mean, there's some indirect ways, like the fact that he's accepted by the Fremen is, an indirect endorsement of his fighting skills. But again, that was another thing you really felt, another claim in the book. We're told that Gurney Halleck and Duncan Idaho had trained their people, almost to the level of equaling the Sardaukar, right? But again, I'm kind of asked to take that on faith. Like we don't see it. We're not shown it really in the film, in the book. In the film, we are at least with Duncan, and to some extent with Gurney as well. We're sort of shown that much more clearly. We're made to feel that, and I thought that was a really good. So I really liked the characterization, especially of Duncan, and I was really glad that they gave Gurney his random quotations from the Orange Catholic Bible. I thought that was another thing I really appreciated. I cheered the first time he quoted. He gave an apt quotation for a moment. So.
Yeah, I think that humanizing element is kind of necessary for this too. 'Cause, there's a question in the chat about why this wasn't as successful as some of the other things like Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, and it comes off as a super science fiction, right? Like it is much more that ilk than it is fantasy, and that's kind of always a little bit more of an uphill battle in the film world, and isn't necessarily associated with blockbuster mentality. And it came out at the end of the pandemic. Most people weren't going to cinemas. So like success, sure, that's going to be an uphill battle anyway. But in terms of story, you kind of need that engagement. And I didn't get that necessarily from the text. You could find it, you could seek it out, but it wasn't given to me. So yeah, seeing the strong emotion of his mother when he was going through the pain challenge, and seeing that camaraderie between Duncan and himself, and the ease of Duncan too, where like he is a bro, so like we do have that kind of personality, in this world. Okay, cool. So you have that kind of, and Paul having a bad day, like in training, you can't have a bad day. I don't care if you're not in the mood, there were these nice moments that you could relate to. I think it could have used more, to be honest, which might have gone against book expectation, which is a risk. So I can see why they didn't lean into that farther, but we didn't have comedic lines. We didn't have, moments you could really like hang your hat on of like, that was great. It was just kind of a long, slow loveliness, right?
I think the first part of the movie with the interaction between Paul and his father.
Yes.
Oh, that was lovely.
Yeah, it's not terribly well founded in the book, but it sets up a lot of things really, really nicely for what the relationship between Paul and his father, and I enjoyed it a lot, even though it's not in the book.
It's actually,
and the importance.
No, go ahead.
And the importance of the decision that Paul has to make. We know
Yes.
from the very beginning he might not want to take up that mantle, and his dad says, "Well, I didn't either at one point. However, it was given an option." So when his father does die, you're like, "Oh God!" The import of that choice is just hammered into us, and that's such a good payoff an hour and a half later.
And the way that got visually hung on the signet ring made both the before and after scenes really, really powerful in that way. Now, I was just going to say that, Trevor, what you said about its relationship to the book is fascinating, isn't it? Because this, I think, would be a really, it would be a whole separate study, actually. It'd be really fun to do a deep dive into that and look at, because, what you can see happening is that conversation between Paul and Leto in the film, in the graveyard, like tomb area, right, when they're talking with the ring and all that stuff, is sort of like they're doing the work that is done in like 5 different scenes in the book, right? Especially a whole bunch of the ones that are on Arrakis. You think of the interactions between Leto and Paul on Arrakeen, and we got almost none of that. We get the Thopter ride, right, on the day that they see the Sandcrawler eaten, but apart from that, we get very little interaction between Leto. In fact, we get very little interaction among people at all in Arrakeen once they're there. We get the shit out Mapes, but very little else. Anyway, so it would be fascinating to look at like the work that's done in the relationship between Leto and Paul in all of their scenes, basically in the whole book, up until Leto dies, and compare that with like the work that's being done in that one scene. Because I do felt that they were kind of piling it all in there, but it worked really smooth. Of course, I didn't realize the first time I saw the film, when I saw that scene, that was like mostly going to be it for Leto and Paul, like, because they hadn't even left Caladan yet. So I'm like, oh, this is just the beginning. But no, that was really most of it. So it's a fascinating example of some of the kind of compression that you're forced to do. Like, how do you accomplish these? So like, what did they accomplish? What did they change? What elements of their relationship did they choose to omit? And what are the consequences of those choices? It would be interesting to do a deep dive into that particular. I hadn't really been thinking about it in that way, but your point there, Trevor, made me think about that.
I think the other thing I noticed kind of along those.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say, one of the things I kind of noticed along those lines is that there's not a lot of dialogue from the book in the movie, but somehow that works. And I think it works because they're trying to explain a story. And in order to do that, they've had to make some changes, but they've kept to this, at least in my opinion, they've kept to the spirit of the book. They've kept to the spirit of the book, even though they've had to change some of the dialogue. That's kind of in contrast, like, for example, the graphic novel adaptation, which I was a little bit disappointed with, because it does keep very clearly to the text. It, quotes huge chunks of it, but it doesn't work. There's something very wooden about it. And the movie, on the other hand, really works well, even though it doesn't have a whole lot of dialogue from the book.
And I think the dialogue in the book is a bit, what it might be too strong a word, but almost overly regal at times, or overly formal. And I think it lends that sense of historical authenticity, as if somebody was writing this down years later. And there's some scenes, and I remember, Corey, you pointed out some of these examples during your podcast course about Dune, just some quotes that really do seem like somebody said, hey, this is going to be a great quote for the historians. Like, let us make sure to underline this. Right. But that's not film dialogue. In the film, right, people have to talk like people.
Yeah.
It's true in the book. I mean, and this, I wonder if this has something to do even with the kind of woodenness that you're thinking of in the more direct adaptation in the graphic novel, Trevor, and thinking about, Dom, just what you were just saying. There is that element of, like, you're almost aware of Princess Irulan's editorial intervention in the dialogue and stuff, especially. Like, these are the crucial quotes that you should know, which doesn't feel organic. But again, it's the frame, the Princess Irulan frame is so persistent in the book that we're kind of put into this sort of frame of mind. It keeps us, in my opinion, one of the effects of all the epigraphs from Princess Irulan is it distances us from the text. Like, we're constantly reminded that this is a historical thing that we're seeing at a distance, and it pushes us back, even as we begin to become drawn in and engaged with the characters in the story. And the film doesn't do that, doesn't allow for that, and so therefore puts it on a different footing. Well, we've got like 5 minutes, so thoughts for the second film, anticipations. What are things that you are most excited about, most looking forward to, most sort of questions that you have about the second film?
I wonder how much they're going to go into. I mean, Dune really is 2 books. It's 2/3 of a book that ends with Dune Messiah, and then it's kind of a book in its own right. And I really wonder how much they're going to bring in of, you know, what we see in Dune Messiah, where he becomes this tyrant, and not to give anything away, but there's going to be a lot of very bad things happening. Are we going to see any of that, or is it going to end kind of where the book does, with him on kind of a high note? I'm kind of surprised if they don't have a little bit of Dune Messiah at the end of that.
I didn't even thought of that question, but that's a really interesting question.
Well, the good news for all of us is that Denis Villeneuve has already talked about adapting Dune Messiah. He said that is his goal. Now, we all have to get to the theater to make that happen.
Right.
But I do think that they're going to have to just be a bit less subtle with the themes of Paul's descent into dictatorship. Like, you can't be as subtle as Frank Herbert was in the book in a major Hollywood film. And I was pleasantly surprised with the first part. Like, it is there. The message is there. It is foreshadowing that Paul is not going to be the savior of this people. And what I've heard from Denis Villeneuve in interviews is he's compared Paul's arc in the first two Dune movies as something akin to Michael Corleone in The Godfather. And that to me seems about exactly right. And in the first Godfather, Michael Corleone just ends up on top. But, you know, and he does some bad things, but he's not, you don't see the worst of it by the end of the first
He's not
Godfather.
a full villain completely by the end. Yeah.
And that makes it more believable, like you said, about humanizing the characters. Like, they can't be perfect. They can't be an absolute savior because he's human.
Yes. Although decreasingly so in the second half of the book. Human, I mean, like, he becomes something weird and other. I mean, he himself is very conscious of that too, right? And that to me is going to be one of the interesting things that I'm looking for. How are they going to handle Paul's transition to Muad'Dib and the choices he has to make? Are they going to humanize this pattern of humanization and the way they have brought us closer to these characters in the first film? Are they going to continue that with Paul? I think that's going to be interesting to see. And the temporal stuff. That's my other question. Like, how freaky is the temporal stuff going to get? Very interesting. The darkness. Trevor, that question of, I'd never even really thought of going beyond. I mean, I admit I had been just assuming that we were going to stop. It was going to stop at the end of the Dune book. But the idea of bringing in Dune Messiah elements, integrating that into the end of the second film is a question I hadn't been asking, but I now realize I should have been.
Well, and interesting,
and I think he's setting us up for it.
Yeah.
Sorry, Trevor, what'd you say?
No, I was going to say, I think he's setting it up for us, setting us up for it. I think there's some bits and pieces in the first movie that should, you know, give you a clear indication that he's afraid that he's going to become something terrible. It'd be weird if they didn't show that, but whatever.
And especially knowing that he wants to do the third film, you'd want to have some sort of setup for that. But it's also kind of a risk, because if there's no guarantee for a third film and you set that up and can't pay it off, then your second film always is going to look unfinished. So I hope they greenlight things before second film comes out, but I don't think they will. We'll have to see how second film goes.
Yeah. Awesome. Final thoughts or observations from either one of you before we head off? I don't want to. It's just about time to end, but I didn't want to end before with the. If you guys have things you wanted to add or say.
Real quickly, just kind of circling back around to the book. I know Corey and Maggie, you know the story, but some of your listeners might not. This book was partly due to you all and your credit or your fault. Trevor and I had the idea for this book at one of the Myth Moots a few years ago, and I think we really took a lot of inspiration from the idea of us people who don't professionally work on literary studies or speculative fiction engaging in the scholarship. And it took a while, it took some time for the academic publishing process to work, but we now have a book out. So it just, I hope people enjoy the book, but also just hope people think of themselves as, to the extent they want to think of yourselves as scholars, or potential scholars.
Yeah, it is true that there's a great deal of good work and brilliant analysis being done by people outside of, people who do not have, tenured jobs in traditional academic posts. I have been delighted to see that work recognized. I've been so excited for you guys in the publication of this book. I think it's wonderful, and really glad that happened. Tomas is wondering where people can find the book. Is it on Amazon?
Yep, Amazon and Kindle and Kindle and paperback, both available on Amazon. And McFarland has
bookseller.
Yeah,
Excellent.
Wherever you buy books.
Very good.
Awesome.
Excellent.
Oh, thank you guys. Well, obviously we'll have you back for the next one. There's not really a choice.
We'll talk about the second film when that comes out. Exactly.
And when
is it
trailer
coming
comes
out? Is it the end of this year?
November
November of this year.
I think early November now.
Nice.
Okay.
Do you know if they finished photography, principal photography?
Pretty sure they have, but I'd have to double check.
Oh, I was going to ask. So they didn't film them together? It wasn't a continuous thing? Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
That'll be interesting in and of itself to see.
Yeah, to see if it's an actual return. It does seem an important question, doesn't it? Like if what we're seeing is just like, if they had the whole thing in mind before they put it out, or if they, the second one is being done. Anyway, yeah, interesting. It does make sense for a time jump. I agree, as they're saying on Twitch chat there. But cool, awesome. Well, great. Well, we will look forward to talking about you guys for the second film when that comes out. Looking forward to seeing that. Thanks everybody for joining us today for another discussion. We're going to be back next week.
I'm not here next week, so red flag.
Oh, right. That's right.
Yeah. So we
Not
might
next week.
change time, or we might skip week, or it might just be Corey. But we'll let you know ASAP.
We'll figure it out. Awesome. Thanks again. Thanks everybody, and we will.
Thanks, guys.
See you guys again soon. Thanks again, Trevor and Dom, for joining us.
You all.
Really appreciated having you guys here.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Thanks for having us. It was fun.
Yeah, thank you.